It is. All right, part 6 of the Harmony of the Gospels. So we're doing 3 kind of scenes this week, if you will. If you've ever tried to map out Paul's missionary journeys, you might be like me and get all confused about the wheres and the whens and the how longs and when he went hither and thither and even went hither and yon. He was like, it's really hard to keep track of, at least in my head. But if you're trying to map out Jesus' ministry, it's all very simple. He started in Judea with the baptism. He went up to Galilee, and except for some trips back to Jerusalem for feasts, that was it. And he came down to Jerusalem at the end. So he went to Perea and Jericho and all that. I'm counting that as Judea, but that's the same region to the south there. But that was basically it. I mention that because right after the first 2 scenes we're going to look at this week, Jesus takes a trip to Jerusalem for a feast. It's not covered in any of the Gospels that we're looking at. It's in the Gospel of John. He's the only one that mentions it. But that trip includes an interaction that really informs some of what we see in the 3rd scene, and there's a theme that starts to assert itself as we go through this. We'll start off with the first one here, which is the call of Matthew. And I realized, I'm handing out the handouts to you people, but for the people online, I'm not telling them what the passages are, so I will try to remember to say what the passages are. Call of Matthew is covered in Matthew 9 through 13, Mark 2, 13 to 17, and Luke 5, 27 to 32. What's interesting, we actually know very little about Matthew, apart from a few mentions here and there. He is one of the authors of one of the Gospels, so we can't say he wasn't unimportant or anything, if we could say that about any of the disciples. But there are some important things that we see about the times of Jesus, first century, the Romans, and all that. We talked earlier about how Matthew was a tax collector. A common term used to describe tax collectors was the term publican. And in the Roman Empire, I learned this week, the week before, there's a whole class of people known as the publicani who did work for the Roman government for pay. They were essentially like we have, public servants, we would call them today. Well, they called them publicans, same idea. They were essentially contractors, the Roman equivalent to a 1099 employee. By the way, there was a hierarchy to some of these jobs that these publicans did. Some of them worked for others of them, and so forth. If you remember the story of Zacchaeus, which was in Luke, the little short guy climbed the tree. You remember the song. He was called a chief tax collector, so he was in charge of the regular tax collectors like Matthew was. Now, to be clear, when we say tax collector, Matthew could have been anything from a toll booth operator to a customs agent to an IRS agent. It could be any of those kinds of things, right? And so we don't know exactly because they did all of those things. Based on where he was when Jesus found him and called him, we can assume he was on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And so the assumption is he was probably like collecting taxes on the fish trade. So you got all the fishermen there catching the fish, they're selling it to the people, he's getting the tax on that trade. It says in Mark 2:13, it says, and he, Jesus, went out again by the seashore, Sea of Galilee, and all the people were coming to him, and he was teaching them. So that's the context in which this call happens. In the next verse, in verse 14, it says, as he passed by, he saw Levi, who was Matthew, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth. So, by the way, Matthew, like Paul and like Peter, went by different names. Matthew is a Greek name. Levi is his Hebrew name. Technically, Peter went by 3 names. So he had Simon was Hebrew, Peter was Greek, and Cephas was Aramaic. So he went by 3. But, Peter, by his personality, he overdid everything. So remember when Jesus was calling Peter and Andrew, we discovered that the calling on the beach where he said, follow me, and they dropped everything and followed him, that wasn't the first time they'd met. And, they had this whole interactions with Jesus back in Judea before the whole follow me part. And I said at the time, it would be extraordinary if it was as abrupt as it reads. Actually, I said it would be crazy. Well, welcome to Crazy Town, because this is all we know about Matthew. And I'm not saying that Matthew didn't have interactions with Jesus, or it's just that if he did, we aren't told about them. But there's just no information about what he knew about Jesus or didn't know about Jesus or any of that. But it's not unreasonable to think that there might have been interactions, because Matthew's working on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is preaching on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. I'm sure he heard a sermon or three. And I'm sure with all the people coming to be healed, he saw a few miracles in all that. Now, we're inferring all of that. We just don't know because the text is silent. But like I said before, it would be kind of crazy if he just walked up to him and said, "Follow me," and he left and followed him. But the next thing we see in the narrative here is that Jesus is invited to Matthew's house for a reception. Remember, of course, I say it all the time, but the Jews despised tax collectors. And so to see Jesus eating with them, that's going to be a big problem. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to point out that Mark tells us in 2:15, it says, "And it happened as he was reclining at the table in his house." Whose house? Matthew's house. That's the context. Okay? So Mark is telling us all of a sudden they're at Matthew's house. Luke tells us in Luke 5:29, and Levi, who is Matthew, gave a big reception for him at his house. So that's why they were there. Good. Mark tells us where they were. Luke tells us why they were there. All that's fine. But look what Matthew himself, the one whose house it is, the one who threw the party, the one who was just called, writes about in this situation. All he says is, verse 9-10, "Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house." But whose house? What was the occasion? He doesn't tell us. Just based on what Matthew wrote, we could assume it's Matthew's house. We could assume it was a reception in Jesus' honor, but Matthew just skips right over all of that. It's interesting. He seems to want to leave himself out of the story as much as possible. He takes no credit for any of this.
That's a good biographer.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. But let's talk about the reaction of the Pharisees, though, because that's really the point of all this. They approached the other disciples and began to complain about Jesus. Here's a tip. If you have a problem with someone, don't bother other people about it. Go directly to them. But that's not the approach that the Pharisees take. This is just cowardly, I think, to go to the disciples. But here's the thing. Later on, Jesus would use a tax collector and a Pharisee as examples in a parable. And his parable, he wanted to show an example of somebody who was hyper-religious, extremely, holy-ish type person, and somebody who was exactly the opposite. And so the examples he used was a Pharisee and a tax collector. And listen to how he puts the words in the mouth of the Pharisee to describe the tax collector. Luke 18:10, "Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself: 'God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I pay tithes of all that I get.' But the tax collector was standing some distance away. He was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, the sinner.' I tell you that this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted." So we all remember this parable. And I'll be honest with you, I can't identify with the kind of prayer that the Pharisee was praying. And I'm not saying that because I don't have pride. Of course I do. But when you're talking to God himself, and you want to thank God for something, why would you thank God for your own piety? Which is what he was doing. I mean, if you want to thank God for something, maybe for something I received, not something I did. And honestly, I can't relate to it. But then again, I thought about it. Maybe the Pharisee was a Calvinist, and so even his piety was a gift from God and something he received. Who knows? I know John MacArthur just died, and I should be kinder, but he knows better now. You can see from that parable what a Pharisee thought about the tax collector. And think of all the examples that you could use as the opposite of a Pharisee. Could have been a prostitute, could have been a murderer, could have been anything. He chose tax collector. So that kind of gives you the idea. They demand to know why Jesus would eat with a tax collector. And so Jesus answers in Mark 2:17. He says, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And Luke's account is almost the same, identical as Mark's. But Matthew's account, back to Matthew, is a little different. Apparently, Jesus said something else as he was saying all of that the others left out. Matthew quotes in 9:12, Jesus is saying, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick." So far, so good. Looks the same. We're tracking. And he continues in verse 13, "But go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Well, in the middle of all that, Jesus quotes the prophet Hosea. The others left it out. Why? Well, I'm sure they leave lots of stuff out because they want to focus on their main points. But why does Matthew include it? Simple. He was the one receiving the compassion. And when you're the one receiving the compassion, it's kind of hard to forget. Right? So that's our first takeaway. Next scene. The disciples are defended. So this is Matthew 9:14-17, Mark 2:18-22, and Luke 5:33-39. Now, is another interaction with Pharisees, but this time, this one's different. They bring the disciples of John the Baptist with them, and this is interesting. You remember the fiery response that John the Baptist had for the Pharisees who came to be baptized back in Matthew 3, I think it is? You could think from that, there's no way they would be on the same side of any issue, right? He called them a brood of vipers. Asked them how they planned on avoiding the fires of hell and damnation, and that they should bear fruit in keeping with repentance. He was not indifferent to the Pharisees. But the issue at hand here is fasting, and as we'll see, also prayer. The Pharisees were doing it. The disciples of John were doing it. Jesus' disciples were not. And so, but yeah, Luke throws in that they were also prayers. He says in 5:33, "The disciples of John often fast and offer prayers. The disciples of the Pharisees also do the same, but yours eat and drink." So, to be clear, they're not just talking about praying. They're talking about the ritualistic prayers and all of the ceremony that goes along with, you thought that we invented virtue signaling. No. They did all of this stuff. This was virtue signaling in the first century. It was a show. And you have to appreciate, though, how sly the enemy is. And yes, I'm absolutely convinced that this was an attack by the enemy on Jesus. Most people expect attacks from questions, tough questions, things like that, from those on the quote-unquote other side, whatever that may be in your context. But to get questioned by people, John the Baptist disciples, who are ostensibly on your side, along with the Pharisees, is, that would give you pause. So when people who are supposed to be on your side join the other side, and they're all coming after you, something's up. Now, depending on which gospel account you read, this may not be obvious. One will say that it's the disciples of John, the others will say that it's the Pharisees, but it's both. And so Mark tells us that the Pharisees came with them, and that they were all apparently asking the same question. It's a little bit of a mob. Mark 2:18 says, "John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came to him, saying, 'Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast? Yours do not.'" And I mentioned how we threw on the prayers and all this. So basically, everyone's looking at Jesus' disciples, and they go to Jesus, and they want to know, what kind of ship are you running here? right? We're doing all the stuff that we're supposed to do, and you guys aren't doing any of it. Like I said, not to beat a dead horse, but if everybody's moving in one direction and you and your friends are moving in the other direction, you take comfort in the fact that at least you got your friends with you. But when some of your friends start going in the other direction with the crowd and they start asking you questions, what do you do now? And I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. How we had these little series of biographies. I inherited them from my parents, the Heroes of the Faith series, and I took the opportunity one year to spend the year reading through them back to back as 20 plus, maybe 30 plus once. They're really easy reads, so it was not as impressive as it sounds. But my most striking takeaway from finishing those books, and it was people like, it was like, I had John Calvin, John Bunyan, Mother Teresa, Billy Graham. It was just the whole gamut of heroes of the faith, as it were. Yeah, is a lot of books. But the thing that really struck me at the end of reading them all was almost every single one of them, almost without exception, had massive opposition to what they were trying to do. And it always came from their family, from the church, from their friends, from people that were closest to them that you would think would want to support them and encourage them. And they all had opposition from all those places. It's always the friendly fire, which I find fascinating. But that's what the enemy does. And that's what I think the enemy is doing this here by getting the disciples of John the Baptist stirred up. So why are you not doing all the religious rituals that literally everyone else is doing? Well, that's the problem. And here, Jesus could have answered by pointing out all the differences between the law and the traditions of men. And, Paul does that. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus instead makes three analogies. With a casual reading of the text, you might read these analogies and just blink and say, what on earth does any of that have to do with fasting and prayer? Jesus cites being a bridegroom, patching a hole in a garment with a new patch of cloth, or putting new wine into an old wineskin. All of that to answer a question about why they don't fast and pray. Well, we'll take them one at a time. Actually, we'll take the first one, and then we'll do the second two together. First, the bridegroom one. Jesus says, according to Matthew 9:15, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them. Can they? But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. So here's some things to note here. First, wedding ceremonies in those days were backwards from what we do in our culture. When we do a wedding, the bride's at the front of the church waiting. The groom is at the front of the church waiting, and the bride comes in and makes the grand entrance. She comes to the groom. That's not how they did it back then. Back then, it was the bride with her bridesmaids were waiting for the groom to show up. And when the groom and all of his guys, remember the parable of the oil and all that stuff, the 10 bridesmaids, when the groom shows up with all of his buddies, that's when the wedding begins. They're waiting for the groom to come. So it's backwards from what we do. And then when he shows up, the celebration is like a week long. So that is not a time to fast, is the point. So when the celebration's done, then the groom took his bride and left to go live happily ever after in the place he prepared for her. Remember the words of Jesus, I go to prepare a place for you. It's a picture of this wedding. In no part of that description is the bridegroom taken away. In fact, you could say the bride is taken away by the groom, right? That's exactly what happens in that picture. So she's taken away from her bridesmaids, she's taken away from her family, but the bridegroom came with his groomsmen and ostensibly should go home with his groomsmen because they're his friends. They probably live near him, and his new bride. And that's the picture. Since we have 20/20 hindsight, though, and because we know what happens, we can understand what Jesus is saying here. He's with his disciples. One day he's going to be taken away from them, twice in fact. But the first time he's taken away, just 3 days, second time for a lot longer. But just think about the one that Jesus has in mind here. When he's crucified, they will definitely mourn, they will definitely fast, and they will definitely pray. So that's what he's foreshadowing here with this answer. So you can say in that day, he will be taken away from them. So that's the first analogy. That's really not much of a mystery, I think, and we can kind of understand what Jesus is saying. I'm pretty certain the people to whom Jesus was speaking had no clue what he was saying here, but he doesn't care. His disciples remembered it, wrote it down, and it makes sense to us with the 2020 hindsight. Now, the next two, though, are not as obvious. The second analogy is the new unshrunk patch on an old garment. Matthew says in 9:16, but no one puts a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and a worse tear results, because when it shrinks, it's going to tear. We get it. Makes perfect sense. What does it have to do with any of this? I'm sure all the disciples were just listening to him and looking at each other, go, yeah, Jesus, thanks for that great point. What the heck is he talking about? Well, while we're at it, let's look at the last one, 9:17. It says, nor do people put on new wine in old wineskins. Otherwise, the wineskins burst and the wine pours out and the wineskins are ruined. They put new wine into fresh wineskins and both are preserved. So it's got to expand. Once it's expanded, it can't expand anymore. You put new wine in, it expands more and it bursts. Got it. To generalize these two things, to get to their essence, it becomes easier to see what Jesus is talking about. And our 2020 hindsight doesn't hurt either. He's given two analogies, mixing old things and new things, and the point is you can't do that. I mean, even if we don't know what these two analogies are saying, we can tell that they're both saying the same thing. That much is obvious. But he's saying that you can't mix old things and new things. They don't go together. Jesus was saying to the Pharisees and even the disciples of John that you're Jews. And you say, Derek, it's a little early to be drinking, isn't it? Of course they're Jews. What I'm saying is they represent the old order of things. And Jesus is bringing a new order. And it's not going to be strictly Jewish. It's going to be something new, right? The old order, people go searching for God. In the new order, God goes searching for people. In the old order, you have rituals to remind us of our inability to please God and our mistakes and our failures, and hopefully to beseech him to not destroy us in judgment. In the new order, there are almost no rituals except those that remind us of Christ and his work on our behalf and his promise for our future. It's a new order of things. And so, if you take a ritual from the old order and you try to use it in the new order, it's out of place, it won't make sense, and it doesn't fit, is what Jesus is saying. And so don't insist on trying to put these things are like new wine in an old wineskin or a new patch on an old garment. 2 Corinthians 5:17, therefore if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. And that's exactly what Jesus is foreshadowing here, right? It's something new. Now, think about all the legalism that is rampant in the church, especially in the first century church. Think of what he's saying here is actually profound and will be completely lost on them until later. He's picturing all of the legalism that is to come in the church. Think about how many times this comes up later. It happened in the book of Acts over and over. Look how hard it was for the first generation of Jewish believers in Christ to let go of Judaism, right? We had all the Judaizers. We had Paul dealing with that in the book of Galatians. We had Peter's apoplexy about going to the house of Cornelius. We had his hypocrisy when he would only eat with the Jews, and then Paul had to call him out on it. All of those incidents were examples of new patches on old garments, new wine in an old wineskin, trying to fit the new thing that Jesus did with the old ways of Judaism. It doesn't fit anymore. Things have changed. And, as Judaism was passing away, there were people who preferred the types of the Old Testament to the fulfillments of the New Testament. And sometimes the craziest part is we have people that still do, even with all the good news. So that's the second scene. Third scene, we come to the plucked grain. This is Matthew 12, 1 through 8, Mark 2, 23 to 28, and Luke 6, 1 through 5. Like I said at the beginning, in between what we just looked at and this passage we're looking at now, Jesus and his disciples traveled to Jerusalem for a feast. I don't think we're told which feast it is. I don't think it matters. But none of these three Gospels mention that scene, what happened during that trip. Only John does. And it's in John chapter 5. We don't have time to read it. It's the whole chapter. It's really good. While he's there, he heals the lame man next to the pool. Remember, the water would stir, people would get in, and the first one in gets cured. Everybody else is... And so this man had nobody to help him in the pool. Jesus heals him. He picks up his pallet and he goes. And then as he's carrying his pallet home, he's accosted by these Pharisees. Why? Because it was the Sabbath, and he was carrying a pallet. Well, I wish I had time to read through John 5 for you. We don't have time. Go read it on your own. Refresh your memory. Jesus makes a speech in the second half of that chapter that will peel paint off a wall. It is as clear an announcement of his deity as anything in the New Testament. And he even states his authority to raise the dead and predicts that he will do that one day. And, so this is what happens on this trip to Jerusalem for the feast. Now they're back, or they're on their way back. We don't know if they're back or on the way, whatever. The topic du jour is his authority over the Sabbath. He healed the man and all that. That's the context in their minds as they're returning. And that brings us to this scene. So at some point, either, like I said, on the way or once they got back, he and his disciples are walking through a grain field. The disciples start picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. I've never done this. Apparently you can do this. Rub them in your hands, breaks off the husks, and you can eat the kernels. Great. Sounds good, right? This was actually explicitly allowed under the law of Moses, that you're allowed to walk through a field. You can hand pick grain to eat of someone else's field. It's not illegal. You can do that. It was a way to help the poor, way to help people who were traveling like they were, and that's fine. The problem is, it was the Sabbath. And technically, at least as far as the Pharisees were concerned, this is harvesting grain, and that's forbidden on the Sabbath. Okay, in their tiny, ridiculous, Pharisaical minds. Now, it is hard to overstate the importance that the Jews placed on the Sabbath. So the Talmud was written 400-ish, 400-ish AD, was actually they collected and wrote down what was previously, some of it was written, some of it was oral, I think most of it was oral, traditions. They were passed down from previous generations. And so that's where they actually put pen to paper to preserve it written. But before that, it was just the traditions, right? And so you remember Fiddler on the Roof, tradition, tradition, tradition. This is what the Jews do. And so that was what they passed down, and they treated that as if it was the law as well. And so the Talmud contained 24 chapters on Sabbath law. 24, are you hearing me in the back? 24 chapters of what you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath. They had 39 categories of work that cannot be done. They called it the 39 melanchot. These include sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, washing wool, beating wool, dyeing wool, spinning, weaving, making 2 loops, one's okay, weaving 2 threads, you can weave 1 thread, I guess, separating 2 threads, tying, untying, sewing stitches, tearing, trapping, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, marking, and cutting. You could write 1 letter of the alphabet. You could not write 2. You could write the aleph, but not the bait. You could erase the aleph, but not the bait. You could only erase 1 letter of the alphabet. You couldn't kindle a fire, nor could you extinguish a fire. Sorry, your house is burning. It's the Sabbath. What can we do? You couldn't build or demolish. And finally, you couldn't carry anything. Now, you're allowed to walk 2,000 cubits from your dwelling, wherever you lived, 2,000 cubits. That distance was known as a Sabbath day journey. That's mentioned in the New Testament. If you placed some food at 1,999 cubits, you could declare that, you had to do it the day before, you could declare that place a residence, and you got another 2,000 cubits. See, that was, yeah, they're slick. Carrying anything was forbidden, even a mat, a scroll, even a child. You couldn't carry a child on the Sabbath, according to these small, tiny-minded Pharisees. And so, thinking about all of the rules here that Jesus and his disciples were breaking on the Sabbath. They were walking through a field. Hopefully it was less than 2,000 cubits from wherever they lived, because that was a violation. They were picking heads of grain. That's reaping. They were rubbing them in their hands. That's grinding. These disciples were just the worst kind of sinners. And so the Pharisees were watching this spectacle and sent them into full pearl-clutching mode. Look at what they're doing. Matthew 12:2 tells us, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now, this is true or not true, depending on what you mean by lawful. You all know the difference between something that's unlawful and something that's illegal, right? Well, unlawful is something that is against the law. Illegal is a sick bird. Dad jokes are the best jokes. So, what they were doing was perfectly lawful if you were just counting it according to the law of Moses. But if you were concerned with the Talmud, the old Jewish study Bible, the traditions, I should say. The Talmud wasn't written yet. But if they're going by the traditions, then things don't look so good for our intrepid travelers here.
The Talmud, you think was added to the Bible?
Yes. It's the Jewish study Bible. That's how you think of it. But, the Pharisees, they treated these traditions and these rules as if it was gospel. It's not. And Jesus didn't even go there. What did he do? He opened with probably the most insulting thing you could say to a Pharisee. Luke 6:3 says, his first words out of his mouth, "Have you not even read?" Now, the Pharisees had read. I guarantee you they had read. They might not have understood, but they definitely had read. But he says, "Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions?" So he's talking about the table of showbread in the temple. Every Sabbath they have 12 loaves, one for each of the tribes. They would put on the bread in the holy place and swap it out every Sabbath. So take out the old bread, put in the new bread. And so under the Mosaic law, the bread, when it came out, was able to be eaten after it was taken out of the temple, but only by the Levites. Yay, week old bread. But in David's case, remember, they're running for their lives, he and his friends, and you know the saying, any port in a storm. But it's interesting that the Pharisees said they were violating the law, when it turns out they were only violating man-made traditions, but with the grain. But Jesus here ups the ante. He skips right past the oral traditions, which are really no law at all, and he goes right to the scriptures describing the actual law of Moses being violated by none other than David. Why don't they criticize David? Going to do that? Because David knew that the lives of him and his men is worth more than some ceremonial restriction. And by the way, the high priest agreed with David and gave him the bread. And so all three of the Gospels that include this scene here agree on this part. But Matthew, again, Matthew adds something more. He says in 12:5-7, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." It's the same thing from Hosea that he quoted before. Isn't that interesting? Matthew, the one who received compassion, keeps remembering that Jesus quotes this prophecy. But yeah, the priests work on the Sabbath. What about them? They're slaughtering on the Sabbath. They're carrying loads on the Sabbath. That seems to be okay. You don't criticize that, do you? Remember, there are 24 chapters and 39 categories of unlawful work. Yeah, they don't apply any of that The rabbis in the synagogues work on the Sabbath. They're not clutching their pearls over all of that. But all of the Gospels say that Jesus concluded this thought with the phrase, "For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." And you remember the last time we saw Jesus healing the man in Peter's house? His friends lowered him down through the roof. And if you remember, Jesus first told him, "Your sins are forgiven." And we talked about how the question in their hearts was, well, who can forgive sins but God? And that's the right question to ask. They just came up with the wrong conclusion. And that Jesus, just like then, Jesus taunts them here by first referring to himself again as the Son of Man, which I pointed out suggested that that was a reference to that second power in heaven, the Son of Man, the human manifestation of God in the Old Testament, the Son of Man. And second, by declaring that he is the Lord of the Sabbath here, is another taunt. He's just dropping grenades here, and he seems completely uninterested in whether or not they react to them or not. He doesn't care for their opinions on the matter. He knows who he is, and he tells them, and they can just deal with it or they cannot deal with it. But to say, when he says he's the Son of Man, second power in heaven, the Lord of the Sabbath, is also a claim to deity. But it's more than just saying the Son of Man, the other power in heaven. He's claiming to be the Creator God, because it was the Creator God that instituted the Sabbath, right? If he's the Lord of the Sabbath, then he's that God. And that's a problem. And so, just like David and the high priest, Jesus seems to understand people are more important than some ceremonial law, right? And with that in mind, and also I think he didn't care because, again, like the patch of cloth and the oil, or the wine, he's doing something new here, and so get off my back is kind of his attitude. But Mark also includes something that the others don't. In Mark 2:27, he quotes Jesus as adding, "And the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." And so, what are our takeaways? Well, we've seen Pharisees freaking out about Jesus eating with sinners. We've seen Pharisees freaking out about Jesus and his disciples not fasting and praying like they did. We've seen Pharisees freaking out about other things that they do on the Sabbath and that they're not supposed to, and even Jesus asserting his authority even over the Sabbath. The thing that ties all these things together is that no matter how right or wrong something may seem, according to tradition, if you will, or even man-made rules, God's first priority is always people. Whether it's David and his men or Jesus and his disciples, it's people over rules. And notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying people over overt sin. None of these things have anything to do with sin. They're just rules of worship and ceremony. But God cares about people because, of course, he does. That's why he came.